Begin Self-Publishing, episode number 11, all for websites.
Interested in self-publishing but don't know where to start? Want to get your book onto Amazon? Want to hold your paperback book in your hands? Learn how on the Begin Self-Publishing podcast with your host, Tim Lewis.
I've heard on other shows people say that the first thing you need as a new author is a website. I'm not sure this is actually true. The first fundamental question is, do you need a website? And the answer has to be, no, you don't. However, is it a good idea to have a website? I would say yes. It is a great idea to have a website. But do you actually need one to be an author? No, not at all. You can do many of the things that people would say you need a website for, independently of having a website. For example, you can set up various email sign-up services like MailChimp to just create pages on their own site that people can use to opt into your email form. You don't actually need your own website to do this. And if you want a presence on the web, there are various free platforms to do it. In fact, Amazon itself sets up this Author Central page that you can set up for free, appears on the Amazon site, and has a load of details about you. I'll put the link to mine in the show notes. And I certainly suggest you want to set up an Author Central page on Amazon, because it makes your books look more professional. So why might you want to create your own website? Well, you get more control over what appears on it, and you're not as vulnerable to the site or the place that you're putting it being taken down or changed in some way that's beyond your control. You're not relying on anybody else's server. So, for example, if you created your entire book empire around your LinkedIn profile, if then LinkedIn suddenly decide to change their terms of service and stop authors from putting any information about writing books on their site, then you're going to be in a very bad position. Websites aren't generally that expensive to run, depending on how you set it up. They also generally look better if they're more customised, more time's been spent on them. Though if you're doing it in a DIY fashion, you can often end up with a fairly awful looking website that costs more than just going for one of these cheapo free sites. In the previous episode, I talked about selling from your website, or selling direct. You can get advantages from this, and you can get general advantages anyway. What I talked about with retargeting, you can do even if you don't sell direct from your website. You can set up things like a little Facebook pixel, as it's called, on your website, and then you can use that pixel to send adverts to people who visited your website in the past. This is a great way of getting interest in new books if you haven't got a large email list. And obviously e-commerce itself, if you live in a country where there are decent tax regimes, is a great thing to do on your own website. Another thing that is quite good about having your own website is, depending on the platform you use, you can do things like run competitions and giveaways. And those can be fantastic for picking up email subscribers or just general traffic towards your book.
You're listening to the Begin Self-Publishing Podcast with Tim Lewis.
In terms of options of getting your own websites on the web, many authors use the free WordPress.com service, which isn't really your own website. It's a website within the WordPress.com area. There's lots of other free equivalent blogging services. Blogging and websites are kind of synonymous. Blogging is an activity that you can do on a website. So basically, when people talk about blogging, they're talking about regularly putting up articles onto a web page. So a blogging framework is just somewhere that lets you create usually in some sort of online editor, a set of pages. So rather than having to hand code or use some other tool to upload web pages, you just go onto this online site and go to a little editor and type in the website page you want to create, and then add it in for you. Now, WordPress.com is a free site which has many, many blogs on it, which are just a series of web pages. There are other sites, I think, like Blogger.com, which are similar. And most of these are completely free. The only problem is you're going to get adverts and other bits and pieces, and you don't have all the bells and whistles that you would have with other options. It's quite confusing because WordPress.com is one option, but there's also WordPress.org, which is using the same code behind the WordPress.com site, but on your own website. And this is an option that an awful lot of people go for. In fact, the beginselfpublishing.com site is a WordPress self-hosted site. So what happens here is that you need to get website hosting. Now, there are many companies that do this, including Amazon Web Services, Bluehost, DigitalOcean, HostGator. There's loads of companies that do this. Even some of the big domain registration companies like GoDaddy do hosting. The trouble with website hosting is that usually there's very big affiliate relationships, and most people only ever use one host. So unless the host does a really bad job, you're not necessarily going to hear by word of mouth which the best hosting companies are. A problem you can get with a lot of them is that your site will work perfectly fine until it gets quite a bit more traffic. So if suddenly you have a big promotion, then you don't want your site going down because you've used the wrong hosting company or you bought too small a plan. For most authors, this is not necessarily going to be that big a problem. But I'm sure we've all been to websites where it just doesn't respond. And that's usually because the hosting company has not got enough capacity to cope with the surge in demand for that website. It is possible to still create old-fashioned, called static sites. A WordPress.org site, the self-hosted one, where you run the WordPress software on your own site, it's very easy to use and is kind of the de facto author website software. However, it is basically having this large database and system running on your web hosting space, which automatically makes it more expensive than a static site. It's possible to have very, very cheap static sites. I've set up a few of these on my AWS, which is Amazon Web Services account. They give you a year's free website hosting if you use their S3 service to host their websites. And even after that, it's kind of like $2 or $3 a month cost. You do get charged for S3 static sites for how many visitors you have. But one advantage is that if you do have a surge, and it can cope with that. However, creating a static site is not that straightforward. There are various online tools for doing it, various static site builders, or you can actually sometimes download whole website templates. But unless you're at least moderately technical, this probably isn't the option to go for. For most people, having a WordPress.org self-hosted site is probably the way to go. But these tend to be more expensive in terms of hosting, and they're not as trivial as people make out. Most website hosting companies have what they call a one-press install option for WordPress. So you'd buy your domain hosting, and then you basically just click to add the WordPress software onto your site, and then it will create you, usually with only a few clicks, a few bits of, maybe a few like email address and a few other bits of information. It will create the website for you. So you'll have a blank WordPress.org site. In general, the default WordPress site doesn't look that great. And I have this concept of themes. There's a whole load of themes that you can download from the WordPress.org site. And there's various paid themes you can use. I use a paid theme from StudioPress.com. One thing that you will notice is that even with the paid themes, the demos you see for a lot of the the themes look lovely until you try and implement it yourself, and then it doesn't quite look as nice. Most of the examples you'll see look great until you actually try and use them. One thing to be very careful of is to make sure your theme is mobile responsive. What this means is that it doesn't look rubbish on a mobile phone. We've often been to sites and you look on your mobile phone and it's got tiny writing, got a pop-up form that covers the entire page and you can't do anything. This is a non-mobile responsive site. Apart from being nice for people looking at your website from a mobile phone, the actual Google search engine penalises sites that aren't mobile friendly anymore. So this is something you want to ensure you have in your theme for WordPress. The only surefire way of doing this is to test it, is to go onto your website from your mobile phone and see what it looks like. The other concept with WordPress is the concept of plugins. And this is really what swung me towards having a WordPress site. WordPress itself as a technology is not particularly new or particularly great, but it is prevalent across the web. And there are hundreds of thousands of developers who develop WordPress plugins. Most of these are free, but again, some are paid. What these plugins do is allow you to add extra functionality. So, for example, if you wanted to add a competition element, there are various plugins for doing that. In fact, there are usually plugins for doing everything. One thing to be very careful about, though, is that plugins can conflict with one another, depending on how well they're written and the nature of your website. You probably want to try and minimise the number of plugins you get and try and keep to more generally well-known ones. Sites like wpbeginner.com have lots of information about what plugins and things you might want to include in your website. I'll include a list of the plugins I've got on my WordPress site in the show notes. So this is not necessarily made as a recommendation of any of them, though the site seems to work stably. I've only paid for one plugin, which is the social warfare one, which is a nice little plugin for doing sharing. But then I'm a bit of a Pinterest and other social media nutter anyway. So this probably isn't something you would want to go for to begin with. There are a couple of things I'd recommend everybody has set up on their website. One of the things you want to do is get Google Webmaster Tools set up. I think they've changed the name into something like Google Search Console now. But this tells you a lot of information about your website. And it's important to have set up because it will tell you if for some reason Google puts a penalty against your website. There are all sorts of weird reasons why your website will fail to be properly ranked in Google search. If somebody has linked to your website from a very spammy web farm for some reason, even by accident, this can totally ruin the ability of your site to be picked up in Google search. If you've got Google Search Console or Webmaster Tools set up, then this means that you'll at least see a message from there saying your site has a penalty against it because of this. It'll give you a chance to do something about that. If you don't have this set up, you just won't know. Now, it used to be the case that getting your site ranked highly in Google was very easy and very important. Now it's still important, but it's a lot more time consuming. And I wouldn't necessarily suggest that people focus on trying to get their site ranked highly in the Google search for, say, fantasy books or self-help books or whatever your genre of writing is about. Still a good idea to eventually hope over time that your site will rank more highly. But there's so much competition now that search engine optimization, or SEO as it's known, is a lot more difficult than it used to be a few years ago. I had quite a time when I read lots of books about SEO, lots of ebooks. The trouble with SEO is it generally tends to be out of date about a year after it's taken place. So any ebooks you read about SEO are generally going to be wrong. The major thing is to avoid what they call duplicate content. So don't put the same web page multiple times on your site. Or cut and paste the entire blog article you've got and put it on a different site for a guest post. It also doesn't necessarily like very short web pages. So make sure you you don't have like 10-word web pages all over your site. Another great free tool from Google that you want to get set up is something called Google Analytics. Once you set this up, which usually involves cutting and pasting a bit of code into the header part of your website, however you do that, this will allow you to see information about the number of visitors, where they're from, how long they stay on your website. You can also do things like track conversions. So if you've got an email sign-up list, you can set up a little conversion goal on your site using Google Analytics, and it will show you what percentage of people converted to go onto your email list. And it will let you drill down into that list and see where these people came from. So let's say you get hundreds of people a day coming to your website, but only 10 out of the 100 are actually signing up for your email list. Now, if you've got Google Analytics set up and you've got the goal tracking set up on your site, then you're able to filter down to just those people who converted. And you can see that maybe all of those 10 people came from Pinterest, when the other 90 who you got from Facebook just didn't convert. Having this kind of information means that you could put more time into your Pinterest pages, or maybe try and work out why the people from Facebook aren't converting. It's a free tool and it's not that hard to set up. There's quite extensive tutorials that Google provide themselves about Google Analytics. Hopefully that's giving you some idea about the tools and things you can use to create an awful website if you want to. But I don't think there's necessarily any compunction to create an awful website in the first place. Certainly this idea that if you set up a website and you'll suddenly get masses of Google search traffic coming to it is probably slightly outdated. I think to look much more professional, having a proper website is a very good idea. But do you actually need one? Probably not to begin with. It may be worth just starting off with one of these free sites and seeing where you go from there. You can spend an awful long time mucking about creating a website and then have nobody come and buy your books or do anything via the website. But certainly a website is something you should look at some point. But don't let it distract you from writing books. It's probably the most important thing to do. Talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by iTunes and rate and leave a review. This helps make the show more visible. For free resources, show notes, and other helpful content, join the community at beginselfpublishing.com.